Good evening, one and all, and welcome to our 111th step in our walking tour through the Bible. And we've got to the last chapter in the first book of the Kings, which finishes off the first book of the Kings. Although the division between the first and second books of the Kings is actually a little bit arbitrary. This chapter tells us about the next Aramite war that Ahab fights. And in this war, Ahab is killed. Ahab's death, funnily enough, is treated with a great deal of sympathy. Indeed, he has an almost tragic grandeur about him. He has been a brave warrior in his time, after all. And his death occurs right at the end of chapter 20, well, not quite at the end, chapter 22. Chapter 22, verses 29 onwards. Someone, verse 34, however, drawing his bow at random, without any special aim, shot the king of Israel between the joints of his armour. Turn about, said the king to his charioteer. Get me out of the fighting, I'm collapsing. But the battle grew fiercer as the day went on, and the king had to be held upright in his chariot, facing the Arameans, the blood from the wound running into the bottom of the chariot, until in the evening he died. At sundown, a shout ran through the ranks. Every man back to his town, every man back to his country. The king is dead. He was taken to Samaria, and in Samaria the king was buried. They washed the chariot at the pool of Samaria. The dogs licked up the blood. The prostitutes watched in it, in accordance with the word that the Lord had spoken. So the Lord, who had spared Ahab despite his sins, gets the last word in. So, and yet it's not quite, it is actually quite a sympathetic treatment of Ahab, who we've been told is the worst king ever. And yet he doesn't quite die a hero's death, but he certainly dies a dignified death. They held him up in his chariot as he bleeds to death. Presumably they tried to stop the bleeding but couldn't. He bravely does not leave the battle. He says, get me out of the fighting, but he stays in the battle, propped up in his chariot, looking alive, knowing that as his life ebbs away, as he dies, his troops will lose heart if he is seen to be dead. And that, in fact, is what happens. So he goes down with his ship. He doesn't desert his troops in the battle. So he dies as a very brave man. Now, what's really interesting about this chapter is before he goes into the battle in cahoots with the king of Judah, they consult prophets. And sure enough, the prophets say, go up, go up. The Lord has given it to you, this town of Ramoth Gilead. Go on, say the prophets. And then Ahab, the king of Judah, says, but there's one other prophet, isn't there? Why don't we listen to him, Micaiah? And he said, oh, I don't like listening to Micaiah. He never says anything nice about me. He said, oh, don't let the king say so. Get Micaiah. Micaiah comes in and says, go up, go up. The Lord has already given it into your hand. And Ahab loses his temper because Micaiah, of course, is being highly sarcastic. Now, the prophets that prophesy victory are a whole crew of prophets, just as there were 450 prophets of Baal. So there seems to be some sort of prophetic brotherhood of the Lord God. But, and they go into ecstasy before the kings and so on and so forth. They sort of writhe on the ground, foam at the mouth. Whereas this guy, Micaiah, is exactly the sort of guy nobody likes because he's sarcastic and he's truthful as well. That's a really awful thing about him. He says things and you can't really ignore them because you know he's speaking the truth. And he said that he had this vision in which a lying spirit came before God and said, let me go and talk to the false prophets. But of course, the king believes the false prophets and refuses to listen to Micaiah. And as a result, the king dies. Now, this is a very interesting passage in the Bible because it pits prophets versus false prophets. Now, the first thing to notice is there's one true prophet, Micaiah, and there are, I think it's 150 fake prophets. There's a whole cohort of fake prophets. So the truth is very much in the minority. The other thing is the false prophets tell the king what he wants to hear, what he expects to hear, what they think he wants to hear. That's rather important. Whereas the true prophet tells the king something very unpopular, and the king has him locked up and put on a bread and water diet as a result. And the king says, I'll deal with you when I get back. He said, oh, you don't, I don't think you are going to get back, he says, which probably must have struck. If you do ever get home safely, the Lord has not spoken through me. But of course, he means The Lord has spoken to me, and you won't get home safely. Now, what we've got here is you've got a whole load of sycophants, and you've got a guy who tells the truth. The church has got to tell the truth, obviously. It would be disastrous if the church tells people exactly what they want to hear. It's also important that the church tells the truth to the people in power, even when the consequences of that might be catastrophic. So there are lots of people, like the prophet Micaiah, who have told people the truth, rulers the truth, and have been locked up for their pains. One of the most obvious is John the Baptist. He spoke truth to King Herod. He was locked up and later executed. And there have been lots of other people like that. Boethius was one. Pope Virgilius was another. People who spoke to the emperor in a way the emperor didn't want to hear were locked up and killed as a result, or sent off into exile, or dealt with very harshly. In our own country, let us remember that great bishop, St. John of Rochester, St. John Fisher, who spoke the truth to Henry VIII, and as a result was executed. All the other bishops did not speak the truth to Henry VIII. After a bit of prevarication, they all gave in. Later, they realized their mistake. People like Bishops Bonner and Gardiner did hold to the truth. When Elizabeth I came to the throne, the Catholic bishops, with one dishonourable exception, Bishop Kitchin of Llandaff, they all went to jail. And they could not have expected nice treatment in jail. They could have expected to be executed. In fact, they weren't executed. Elizabeth I was too canny to make martyrs. She just locked them up and let them die in jail. But still, not a great way to end your career. Now, if you want to get on in society, it's quite often the best way to not say the truth and sort of gloss it over and say, oh no, let's talk about something else. The church has got to speak the truth to power. And the church mustn't be a sycophantic voice telling the people in power that what they are doing is the right thing. So at present, if you look at it now, at present, there are many things that the church should be speaking out about and is speaking out about. So, for example, the persecution of Christians in China is something Christians are speaking out about all over the world, and so they should. The persecution of Christians in the Middle East and in various parts of Africa is something that we are speaking out about. We do have dedicated charities that try and raise awareness of these issues. And of course, the church must speak out about government policy which is anti-Christian, in particular, abortion. The church must not try and shy away from talking about abortion, even though it is quite a hard topic to address. Luckily, in America, many of the bishops have been forthright in condemning the government's support of abortion and the government's encouragement of abortion, it has to be said, because they the American government unfortunately gives aid which has strings attached to it to promote abortion in the third world. So these are all things that the church needs to speak out about. And like Micaiah, we might end up in jail, or we might end up in something worse than jail, I think, and that is the doghouse. That is to say, you might end up being shunned by society. As for the false prophets, don't listen to them. And in the end, if the church goes down the false prophecy route, telling people what they want to hear, eventually those false prophets will be scorned. Now, Dean Ing, the Anglican Dean of St. Paul's, said something very interesting. If the church is married to the spirit of the age, in the next age, she will be a widow. And so it has proved in various countries where the church has got too close to the state and has turned into cheerleaders of the state. When the state falls, then the church has followed. That's happened in one or two places I can think of. So we have to be brave and we have to be prophetic. And being prophetic means being counter-cultural. You will have noticed that there are many governments, many people in public office who won't speak out about what is happening in China, what is happening in Ukraine, and places like that, because they don't want to rock the boat. But the church sometimes just has to rock the boat. I do admit it's difficult sometimes to speak out. I do admit this because I find it hard to do myself. And of course, we do have the terrible example before us about Nazi Germany. When the bishops of Holland spoke out against the Nazis and their racial policies, what happened is that the Mischlings, those who were either Jews who'd become Christians or people who were only half Jews, were rounded up and deported to Auschwitz. And therefore, it was thought if we speak out, it'll make things much worse. And there is, there is a more than a grain of truth in that. At the same time, the fact that the church was so cautious in speaking out against Hitler's racial policies and against the Holocaust has cost us dearly in the years since 1945. And it would have been better, much better, if the voice of the church had been much more forthright in condemning Hitler right at the beginning. If Hitler had been condemned by the church right at the beginning, it might have made a real difference. The church did speak out against the Nazi euthanasia program, the killing of the handicapped, and the killing of the handicapped did stop as a result because there was quite a widespread revulsion against it in Germany. If the church had showed a bit more moral leadership in the early 1930s about anti Semitism, rather than saying, oh, well, it's not really our concern, then it might have made a huge difference to the eventual outcome. Now that makes you think. So we've got a whole load of lying prophets. We got a prophet who tells the truth. Don't go with the majority. Be with the solitary voice. Tell the truth. Bye for now.